It happened in the span of 5 minutes. No warning. No whispers. No leaking Vatican memo. Just one name, one ancient hall, and one sentence that shattered centuries of protocol. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pontiff, the son of steelworkers turned shepherd of souls, stood before the College of Cardinals in crimson silence. His voice did not tremble. His eyes did not search for approval. But when he spoke, he removed Cardinal Luis Tagle. The man known as the voice of the global South. The beloved pastor of the poor. The theologian who wept with orphans and outlasted tyrants. Gone. In a moment. And then. Pope Leo said something so unexpected, so piercing, that the Vatican itself seemed to flinch. This wasn't exile. It wasn't scandal. It was something older. Something sacred. And the moment that followed? Some wept. Some gasped. Some fell to their knees. But all were silenced. Before we go deeper, comment below, where in the world are you watching this from? Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for headlines, but for the holy weight behind them. Still won't? Then enter the comments and confess, what are you afraid of hearing today? Pope Leo XIV was no stranger to contradiction. He had walked among blue-collar laborers in Pittsburgh, listening to their confessions with calloused hands still blackened from coal. And yet now, he wore white, chosen to lead 1 billion souls. They called him the Reformer, but he never wore that name with pride. He preferred titles given in secret: Father, Witness, Servant. Beneath the papal vestments beat the heart of a man who had been broken by suffering, and refined by silence. Not all admired him. But even his critics respected him. He was the first to declare that power had no place at Peter's table, only truth. And among those who once sat closest to him was Cardinal Luis Tagle. Their bond was born not in Rome, but in the slums of Manila and the dusty fields of Chiapas. Two shepherds without borders, Tagle with his trembling compassion, Leo with his tempered fire. They studied Scripture side by side, not to argue dogma, but to weep over it. They agreed that the Church must descend before it could ascend. That theology without tears was just noise in God's ears. Tagle had been Leo's echo. His quiet conscience. When Leo rose to the papacy, many believed Tagle would be his shadow, forever beside him. But shadows grow long. Especially when the sun begins to set on an era. Now, inside the apostolic palace, history moved without audience. No cameras. No applause. No journalists live tweeting from St. Peter's Square. Only red-robed men seated in stone silence. A hush held the room like a chapel before a funeral. Not because someone had died, but because something holy was about to be buried, so that something greater might rise. This was not politics. This was not punishment. This was realignment. A pivot not of power, but of purpose. The Holy See did not tremble for scandal. It trembled for truth. The silence inside the apostolic palace was thick, not from fear, but from the weight of watching something eternal shift. Then, like a single drop in still water, a voice rose. Not from the College of Cardinals, but from behind them, a Vatican journalist granted rare access to the closed meeting. His voice was respectful, but tinged with the trembling hunger of every man who knew he was in the presence of something irreversible. Holy Father, why now? Cardinal Tagle has always served faithfully. Why remove him, today? The question hovered, more fragile than bold. Pope Leo did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence return. He allowed every heartbeat in the room to echo the question back toward the asker. Then, finally, with the gravity of a man who had buried both friends and illusions, he spoke: faithfulness must evolve with clarity. He turned his gaze toward the crimson wall of cardinals, but it was the air itself he seemed to address. Not all wounds are visible. And not all callings remain in the same room forever. There was no anger. No defense. Only the stillness of a shepherd who had learned to speak only when silence would cause harm. But still, the unease rippled. A cardinal in the back, old, weary, born of the Curia, leaned toward his brother and whispered behind a folded hand, "Is this personal, or prophetic?" Perhaps he meant for the whisper to stay buried. But Pope Leo, who had learned long ago how to read a room without needing to hear it, responded anyway. Without turning, without raising his voice, he said, "I do not dismiss. I release." The room stilled again, this time not with confusion, but confrontation. This wasn't the language of bureaucracy. This was the language of spirit. Of letting go not with punishment, but with purpose. Of sending forth, not casting out. Subscribe now, or forever wonder what truth you avoided by staying on the surface. Faith Hidden Stories holds the things headlines cannot carry. Still won't? Then right below, is it doubt, or discomfort that's keeping you quiet? But silence, once broken, is a hard thing to mend. The question had been asked, and the answer, though sacred, was not enough for every man seated in that vaulted chamber. In Rome, no decision lives alone. It breathes with context. It walks with rumor. And in the hours before this gathering, murmurs had already begun to slip through the marble halls. Had Cardinal Tagle been resisting Pope Leo's reforms? Had the man known for kneeling beside beggars begun, quietly, to step away from the path Leo was carving through centuries of institutional pride? Was he theologizing from the sidelines? While Leo was bleeding in the field? No one dared ask aloud. But the room had heard the whispers. And so had the Pope. He did not call them out. He called them in. With a stillness so heavy it drew every eye to his, Pope Leo stepped forward from his high seat, and spoke, not as pontiff, but as a man remembering pain. "I once washed the feet of a dying priest. He had been exiled from his own diocese. Not for heresy. Not for scandal. But for telling the truth too early. For naming a wound that others still called tradition. He looked at me, with no bitterness, and whispered, 'Let them take my name. I gave it up long ago.'" A breath moved through the hall. The story wasn't about Tagle. And yet, it was. Then Pope Leo did something he rarely did. He raised his voice, not in rage, but with sacred heat. Silence is not always humility. Sometimes, it is refusal to grow. The words cracked through centuries of ceremonial decorum. And then, a reaction. A senior bishop, known for his posture of caution, his doctrine precise as marble, rose from his seat, his face flushed. "Your Holiness," he began, "surely there is wisdom in waiting. Not all quiet men are cowardly." Pope Leo did not flinch. He did not strike back. But his reply was a blade dipped in oil. "Tell me, have you cried with the laity lately? Or have you only argued doctrine?" Silence again. But this time, it was shame that spread like incense through the room. No one responded. Because everyone felt what had just been said. This was no longer about Tagle. It was about all of them. And whether they were still men of flesh and spirit, or just caretakers of titles. Don't just watch. Witness. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories if your heart still burns for truth spoken with trembling courage. Still won't? Then enter the comments and tell us, when was the last time you wept over the church instead of debating it? The air in the apostolic palace had grown dense. Not hot. Not cold. But waited, as if the walls themselves had begun to lean in, listening. Then, without spectacle, Pope Leo XIV rose to his feet. The rustle of his robes echoed like thunder in a sanctuary. No bell rang. No chamberlain announced the transition. But every man present knew. The conversation had ended. Now came the revelation. He stood tall, but not to tower. He stood as one does when about to carry something heavy, shoulders squared not in pride, but in readiness. And with a voice neither loud nor soft, he said, "This is not punishment." He let the words fall. Then, with his gaze locked not on any man, but on the empty space between them, he continued, "This is pilgrimage." The room inhaled, some visibly. Some not at all. He took a breath, not for drama, but for remembrance. Then, almost like a confession, he spoke again, "Some months ago, Cardinal Tagle came to me. He came not with papers or plans, but with tears. He said, 'Holy Father, I fear we are losing something. We are building faster than we are burning. Our words outpace our weeping.'" Leo paused. His next words were a whisper laced with flame. He said, "We have exchanged fire for fabric. And the church is going cold." No one interrupted. The silence was no longer awkward. It was sacred. Then Pope Leo, his voice steady, spoke the line that would echo through the walls of the Vatican for decades to come. "So I sent him where the fire is needed most. Away from titles. Into the dust. Not to be silenced, but to ignite." No one moved. Not the bishops with their pens. Not the guards at the door. Not even the journalist who had made his career on interruptions. All were still. And then came the decree, delivered with the solemnity of a burial and the clarity of a trumpet: Cardinal Tagle will leave Rome. Effective now. To serve not the elite, but the forgotten. To go not with banners, but with bread. Not as a cardinal, but as a brother. The silence cracked, not with sound, but with awe. Because in a world addicted to status, this was rebellion. In a church tangled with protocol, this was prophecy. Truth like this isn't shared. It's steward. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, and carry the weight of what matters. Still won't? Then comment below, what part of you still refuses to be sent into the dust where the fire lives? The gravity of Pope Leo's words still hung in the air like incense, but not all hearts had caught up with the spirit of the moment. From the far side of the chamber, where media personnel were cordoned off behind a velvet rope, came a sharp breath, and then a voice, thin with confusion and coated in the varnish of secular language. "So, he's demoted?" It was not a question meant to challenge. It was a question born of a world that cannot imagine surrender without shame, or downward movement without disgrace. Pope Leo turned his head, not with anger, but with mercy. His eyes locked onto the journalists like a father who knew the son did not yet understand. And he answered, not for the press, but for every soul listening across time, "No, he is not demoted. He is entrusted." The word carried an ancient weight, something older than rank, deeper than visibility. Then came the part that no one had expected. With his hands folded before him, Pope Leo revealed what no public statement had dared to explain: Cardinal Tagle came to me in private. No cameras. No counsel. He said he could no longer bear the noise of comfort. That he feared. Rome had become too clean. Too measured. Too safe. A rustle passed through the room, not from movement, but from revelation. He said, "If Christ is still bleeding, how can I still be sitting?" So we agreed, that his hands must return to the wounded. His eyes to the unseen. And then, Leo spoke a line that pierced the chamber like a shard of stained glass: he will walk barefoot through the slums of Calcutta, with no cameras. No applause followed. No words came after. Only silence. But not the silence of confusion. This was the silence of recognition. Of men confronted with something uncomfortably pure. Because nothing is more threatening to the comfortable than a man who gives up power, not for another seat, but for the ground. Pope Leo didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The Holy Spirit had already filled the space his words left behind. And in that moment, Rome was not watching a transfer of position. It was witnessing a resurrection of purpose. Don't consume this moment like news. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories if your spirit still trembles for something real. Still won't? Then tell us in the comments, why do you fear a church that kneels, when Christ did the same? The room remained still, its silence no longer uncertain, but reverent. The kind of stillness one feels when standing in the shadow of something holy, not because it sparkles, but because it bleeds. Pope Leo XIV turned once more, this time not to the cardinals, but to the small gathering of press, seated like schoolchildren on the outer edge of a sacred fire. And he spoke. Not with defiance, not with triumph, but with the tone of a shepherd who knows that not all sheep recognize the gate at first glance. This church, it is not made of stone. It is made of those willing to be broken. No phrase had ever so gently dismantled centuries of granite. Not because the stones had no place, but because they had come to replace the wounds. Then, slowly and deliberately, the pontiff lifted his hand. And with eyes that seemed to scan through time, he whispered a blessing. Not just over Tagle's departure, but over the very path he now walked. Go with God, and with no title but brother. Let the dust you gather testify louder than the praise you once received. He turned now to the invisible audience, not the cameras, not the recorders, but us. The watching world. The skeptics. The faithful. The fractured. I know why you came, he said. You came for scandal. But I offer you something else. I offer you sacrifice. Not the bloodied kind, but the silent kind. The kind that goes unseen, but reshapes everything. And with a voice lowered almost to a prayer, Pope Leo offered his final rebuke, not to punish, but to purify. Let no man call punishment what heaven names preparation. With that, he stepped back into silence. And in doing so, reminded the world that holiness does not always roar. Sometimes, it walks away quietly, barefoot, and burning. What would you have said, if you were in that room? Would you have questioned the Pope, accused him of cruelty, of politics, of spiritual theater? Or would you have wept, not because Tagle was leaving, but because you understood the weight he had chosen to carry? Would you have stood up to challenge, or knelt down to listen? Because sometimes holiness doesn't arrive dressed in robes. Sometimes, it walks barefoot into the forgotten corners of the world, armed only with a bowl, a towel, and a name no longer needed. This was never about punishment. It was about preparation. Not exile, but exodus. And if you've watched this far, if something in your spirit paused, ached, or burned, then this story was never about them. It was always about you. So take a breath. Let the silence settle into your bones. And hear this blessing, not from Rome, not from marble, but from the quiet place where God still speaks. May we all seek truth, with humble hearts. And may your soul not leave this channel unchanged. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Not for stories, but for sacred confrontations that make us whole. Still won't? Then speak honestly below, what part of this truth stirred, or scared, you the most?